It was just an embrace. No speeches, no flags, no fanfare. Yet beneath the Accra sun, history shifted. Two presidents stood face to face, and a quiet tremor ran through West Africa. Not from war, not from protest, but from something rarer. Dignity shared. At first, it looked like ceremony, a polite gesture between neighbors. But those who watched closely saw something else, a tremor beneath the surface. Because behind the smiles and handshakes stood something far greater than diplomacy. It was defiance, dressed in warmth. For decades, Ghana had walked in the shadow of great powers. Partner to Washington, student of London, friend to Brussels. But by January 2025, the friendship was fraying. Tariffs tightened, visas revoked, pressure mounting. And as old alliances began to crack, a question echoed through Accra's quiet corridors of power. Was it time to look across the ocean or across the continent? That was when Wagadougou answered, and one young leader, Ibrahim Traoré, extended his hand. Not as an equal in status, but as a brother in struggle. Was this simply diplomacy, or the quiet birth of a new African era? Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. If this story resonates, show your support with a like, a comment, or a subscription. It means more than numbers. It keeps the story alive. By the dawn of 2025, Accra was a city of questions. The air was heavy, not with dust, but with uncertainty. In the markets of Makola, women counted their earnings twice, afraid tomorrow's prices would rise again. The cedi had fallen for the third month straight. Inflation climbed above 22%. And every conversation, whether in Parliament or in a street cafe, carried the same weary phrase, "Something must change." Then change came, but not the kind Ghana had hoped for. In early April, Washington announced tariffs on Ghana's key exports, 10% at first. Cocoa, textiles, aluminum. The decision landed without warning. By August, the rate had climbed to 15%. Overnight, the nation's economic lifeline was choked. Shipments delayed, factories slowed, and the once proud farmers of Ashanti watched their profits vanish into the Atlantic. Ghana's trade under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, worth more than $340 million, was suddenly hanging by a thread. The agreement itself would expire on September 30th, 2025. In less than a month after the first tariffs hit, export figures to the United States had dropped by nearly a quarter. For many Ghanaians, this was not policy, it was punishment. The government tried to reassure the nation. Press releases called it temporary turbulence, but the people saw it differently. In the bustling trotros and in the crowded university halls, anger simmered. How could a partner, an ally, turn the screws so easily? Then came the second blow. In September, Ghana signed an agreement with the United States to accept West African migrants deported from American soil. 14 people arrived, 13 Nigerians, 1 Gambian. Officially, it was labeled a humanitarian arrangement, regional solidarity they called it. But to most citizens, it felt like humiliation disguised as cooperation. Protesters flooded Independence Square, carrying signs that read, "Ghana is not a dumping ground." Civil society groups filed lawsuits. Commentators on Joy FM and City TV asked the same burning question: whose dignity are we protecting? Inside the presidential palace, John Mahama stood at the center of a storm. His administration faced pressure from every direction. Foreign investors demanding reforms, opposition parties demanding accountability, and the restless youth demanding a future. He spoke quietly one night during a closed cabinet meeting. His words would later leak through a staffer's note. We can survive tariffs, we can survive debt, but we cannot survive the loss of dignity. That single sentence began to echo beyond those walls. Because beneath the spreadsheets and press briefings, Ghana's crisis was no longer just economic, it was existential. For decades, Ghana had been the model student of Western democracy, a nation praised for stability, partnerships, and predictable politics. But stability, the president now realized, had come at a price. Every time a loan arrived from abroad, a piece of independence was quietly signed away. The pressure did not just squeeze the economy, it squeezed the soul. University graduates faced unemployment rates near 20%. Young people unable to find work watched their parents' generation defend policies written thousands of miles away. The frustration was not loud, it was weary. The kind that seeped slowly until a society no longer believes in itself. And yet, beneath the fatigue, something was stirring. On the streets of Accra, murals began to appear overnight. One showed a woman breaking a chain made of dollar signs. Another painted two hands reaching across a torn map. One marked Ghana, the other Burkina Faso. Across social media, a new phrase spread among students: African solutions for African futures. For the first time in years, people were not talking about aid, they were talking about alignment. Not about investors, but about identity. And somewhere in those late-night radio debates, another name began to surface. A name whispered first with curiosity, then with conviction. Ibrahim Traoré, the young soldier turned president from Burkina Faso, who had expelled foreign troops, defied France, and stood before the world declaring Africa's right to choose its own path. To some in Accra, he was a symbol of chaos. To others, he was hope made flesh. Mahama listened. He watched. He read the reports crossing his desk. Reports about rising youth unrest, shifting alliances, and the quiet momentum building across the Sahel. Then one evening, he turned to his advisors and asked the question that would change Ghana's direction. What if the answers we have been searching for are not in Washington, but right next door? That question, whispered in a small room, carried farther than anyone could have predicted. Because in that moment, Ghana's story stopped being about survival and began to be about sovereignty.
And as the winds from the Sahel began to blow southward, one truth grew impossible to ignore. When dignity becomes a question, alliances begin to shift. At this point, I want to invite you into something bigger than watching. Leave a thank you in the comments. It might be thank you Traoré, or thank you Burkina Faso, or simply thank you for hope. Why? Because each thank you carries weight. Each thank you says, I hear this, I feel this, I stand with this. Imagine hundreds of people adding their thanks. It turns a video into a movement. So write your thank you now and let your voice be part of this shared journey. His name crossed borders faster than any convoy. First through whispers, then through headlines, and finally through the hearts of a restless generation. Ibrahim Traoré. To the West, he was a radical, a uniformed rebel who challenged the old order. To millions of young Africans, he was something else entirely, a mirror, the reflection of what courage might look like if it ever took human form. In Accra, across crowded dormitories, the glow of phone screens lit up the night. Students watched his speeches, subtitled in English, their faces caught between disbelief and admiration. Here was a man not yet 40, standing before the world's most powerful nations, refusing to beg. He spoke not with the polished cadence of a diplomat, but with the clarity of a man who had nothing left to lose. When a people rise, they do not ask permission, he once said. Those words, replayed on Ghanaian social media, became more than a quote. They became a challenge. Within weeks, hashtags like African Dignity and No New Chains trended across Ghanaian Twitter. Independent filmmakers released short documentaries titled The Last African Hero, blending footage of Traoré's fiery addresses with images of Sankara and Nkrumah, the fathers of old dreams reborn in new faces. On the campuses of the University of Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, professors who once lectured on European governance began opening classes with a different question. What does sovereignty mean to a continent still bound by invisible chains? For the youth, that question was not academic, it was personal. Kofi, a 23-year-old economics student, summed it up in a campus interview. We do not want handouts, we want our own destiny. If Burkina Faso can say no, why cannot we? And so the conversation began to shift. From aid to autonomy, from imitation to invention, from dependency to dignity. Ghanaian talk shows that once debated exchange rates and IMF loans now spoke of Pan-African resilience. Even the language of politics began to change. Policy memos circulating within the Ministry of Trade quietly referenced regional balance, non-aligned partnerships, and indigenous cooperation. Beneath every careful phrase lay an unspoken name, Traoré. But what truly unsettled Washington and Brussels was not his speeches, it was his reach. He was influencing minds in places he had never visited, shaping policy in nations he did not rule. In Accra's art districts, murals appeared showing Traoré's face beside the words, "We did not ask for permission." For the first time in decades, Ghanaian youth were quoting an African leader with the same reverence once reserved for Western icons. And it scared people. To the old political elite, this awakening felt dangerous, too emotional, too unpredictable. They saw in Traoré's rise the same spirit that had once overthrown empires. But to the new generation, it felt like oxygen. One night, a popular radio host posed a simple, trembling question. If the Sahel stands for freedom, will Ghana stand with it or against it? The question hung in the air, unanswered, because in truth, Ghana was already deciding. Not through decrees or declarations, but through imagination. Traoré's defiance was spreading like music, uncontainable, defiant, alive. And in the quiet halls of Accra's government buildings, Mahama's aides began to notice a subtle shift in tone. The president, once cautious and pragmatic, now spoke of partnerships within the continent. He mentioned mutual sovereignty. He used words that sounded less like policy and more like conviction. Something had ignited. The man in Wagadougou had not sent troops, nor aid, nor propaganda. He had sent an idea. And that idea was marching south. It reached classrooms, churches, cafes, and finally the corridors of power. By the time advisors realized it, it was too late. The decision was already forming. The world would soon see two presidents standing side by side in Accra, speaking not of trade or treaties, but of brotherhood. The spark from the Sahel was about to meet the storm from the coast, and when they met, the ground beneath West Africa would shift.
Now, let us turn this story into a shared moment. Write in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, your corner of the world. One Nation Africa will read them with gratitude, and we send to each of you a heartfelt wish. May your journey be filled with dignity, hope, and light. This is more than a video. It is a gathering of voices across the globe. The cameras flashed, but the world seemed to fall silent. In the golden heat of January, on the steps of Black Star Square in Accra, two presidents stood face to face. John Mahama, steady, deliberate, seasoned. Ibrahim Traoré, young, unflinching, unbent. Then it happened. A slow, deliberate step forward, an embrace, and the words that would echo across a continent. We are one people. Colonial borders divided us. For a moment, the crowd forgot to cheer. It was not politics anymore. It was something older, something buried beneath centuries of maps and flags. News agencies called it a gesture of friendship. But in the markets of Kumasi, in the classrooms of Wagadougou, and in the quiet corners of Washington's policy circles, everyone knew this was not ceremony. This was signal. Because no African leader had spoken so plainly in years, and certainly not while standing beneath the gaze of Western embassies just miles away. The embrace carried the weight of unspoken truths. It said, we remember who drew these borders. It said, we can rewrite the lines. It said, we are done asking for permission to be whole again. As Mahama and Traoré walked side by side down the red carpet, their steps were measured, but their message was not. They spoke of integration, infrastructure, and trade. But beneath those technical words lay something more radical: trust. During the joint press conference, Mahama's tone shifted. He did not read from the teleprompter. He looked up, meeting the cameras directly. For too long, he said, our nations have been neighbors in geography, but strangers in purpose. That ends today. Traoré nodded, his voice calm but resolute. Burkina Faso stands with Ghana, not as a partner of convenience, but as a brother in destiny. The journalists scribbled, analysts parsed every phrase. But the people did not need translation. They understood. The embrace had spoken louder than any communique. Across Ghana, reactions rippled like waves. Young people shared the footage on their phones, adding the caption, "One Africa." Old men at roadside bars raised their glasses and murmured, maybe Nkrumah's dream is not dead after all. But in the offices of diplomats, the tone was less sentimental. One European envoy reportedly told a colleague, "It is not the handshake that worries us. It is the eyes watching it." Because from Cairo to Lagos, from Bamako to Nairobi, people were watching. Not a military parade, not an IMF meeting, but an embrace between equals. That image, two presidents smiling beneath the same flag of dust and sun, traveled faster than any press release. And somewhere in the distance, the old narratives began to tremble. As the press conference ended, Mahama turned briefly toward Traoré and whispered, almost off mic, "This is just the beginning." Traoré nodded, his face unreadable, but his reply was firm. "Then let us build the road." They did not mean asphalt. They meant destiny. A new corridor was forming, not yet on the map, but already in the minds of millions. A corridor not of trade, but of trust. And soon it would have a name: the Wagadougou-Accra Corridor. It began as an idea spoken in confidence, and soon it became a blueprint for something larger than trade. By the spring of 2025, engineers from Ghana and Burkina Faso were walking side by side across dry northern plains, holding rolled-up maps and surveying the land. They called it the Wagadougou-Accra Corridor. Officially, it was a transport project, a 950-kilometer railway linking the port of Tema to the heart of Wagadougou. But anyone who understood West Africa's history knew it was far more than steel and soil. It was a statement that two nations, once divided by empire, could build their own bridge without permission and without apology. At the signing ceremony in September, a quiet cheer rose from the gathered crowd as President Mahama placed his hand on Traoré's shoulder. "We are not building a road," he said softly. "We are building freedom in motion." The technical plans were ambitious. New rail lines, road rehabilitation, cross-border customs simplification, and direct flights to unite the capitals by air. Economists estimated transport costs could fall by 40%. For the landlocked Sahel, that meant lifeblood, a way to breathe again. But for Mahama, the corridor was more than logistics. It was redemption. For decades, Ghana had been a gateway for Western corporations and foreign investors. Now, it was becoming a gateway for Africans themselves. The Ministry of Trade described the project as a spine for regional self-reliance. In Wagadougou, newspapers hailed it as the road through history. The collaboration did not stop with steel and cement. Burkina Faso opened its solar facilities to Ghanaian engineers. At the Zagtuli plant, a 33-megawatt beacon of sunlight and sovereignty, young Ghanaian technicians arrived to study how a Sahel nation could power itself without waiting for World Bank grants. In return, Ghana shared its agricultural research on cocoa sustainability and water conservation. Burkina-based scientists visited the Cocoa Research Institute near Tafo, where hybrid seedlings grew under careful observation. What had once been competition was becoming communion. In both capitals, the language of politics began to change. Words like donor and beneficiary quietly disappeared from speeches. They were replaced by partner, brother, and builder. Even the markets felt it. Traders who once traveled only between Accra and Lomé began venturing north, following the trail of opportunity. A woman named Amma, who sold handmade textiles, told a local reporter, "For the first time, I am not exporting to Europe. I am exporting to Africa, and it feels right." Her words captured what statistics could not. The corridor was not just carrying goods, it was carrying pride. But the project also drew eyes from beyond the continent. Western diplomats expressed concern over the pace of Ghana's new partnerships. Beijing offered to fund infrastructure. Moscow sent representatives to discuss fertilizer and mining cooperation. Every handshake in Accra now seemed to echo in Washington. Still, Ghana pressed on. When Mahama visited Wagadougou later that year, he was greeted not with ceremony, but with drums. The streets were lined with banners reading, "One people, one future." In his speech at the presidential palace, he said, "We do not reject the world. We simply refuse to be defined by it." That line drew applause, not just from the audience, but from millions watching across the continent. Because in the story of the Wagadougou-Accra Corridor, they saw more than geopolitics. They saw a road paved with something no outside power could lend or take away: trust. And trust, once awakened, is hard to contain. It travels faster than trains, stronger than treaties, deeper than debt. The corridor was no longer a project. It was an artery, carrying a new pulse through West Africa. And though the maps would later trace its route in steel and stone, its first foundation had already been laid in the quiet resolve of two presidents who dared to say, "We can build for ourselves." The world had seen alliances shift before, but rarely this quietly. No declarations of withdrawal, no fiery speeches of defiance, just two nations building while others began to whisper. In Washington, analysts at think tanks started using new phrases: soft breach, Sahel corridor influence, non-aligned drift. To them, Ghana's partnership with Burkina Faso was not simply regional, it was symbolic. A country once held as the model student of Western cooperation was now writing its own exam. European diplomats echoed the unease. In Brussels, one policy memo leaked to the press read, "Accra's tone is changing. Cooperation remains, but conviction has shifted inward." Even neighboring nations felt the tremor. Togo's officials warned that youth movements are watching Accra too closely. Côte d'Ivoire, facing its own economic fatigue, feared the spirit might cross its border. And in Abuja, Nigeria scholars were more philosophical. One op-ed in The Guardian Nigeria asked, "Is Ghana rebelling or simply remembering who it is?" But inside Ghana, the mood was different. In crowded cafes and on university lawns, the air buzzed with a new kind of confidence. Murals of Traoré and Mahama began appearing side by side, painted beneath the same colors of dust and sunlight. A slogan spread through social media like wildfire, "From the Sahel to the sea." Some saw it as optimism, others called it audacity. At a town hall meeting in Tamale, an elderly farmer stood up and spoke softly into the microphone. When they built borders, they forgot our blood runs past them. The room fell silent. It was not applause that followed, it was recognition. And somewhere within that silence, the meaning of the moment began to crystallize. Perhaps independence had never been a single event in 1957. Perhaps it was something that must be reclaimed over and over by every generation that forgets its worth. Maybe independence is not a flag raised once. Maybe it is a question we must keep answering. That was Ghana's pause, a sermon in reflection. And yet, even as hope filled the streets, caution filled the airwaves. Reporters warned of risks, diplomatic friction, foreign funding cuts, market reactions. But to those watching the new rail lines being laid across the red soil, it did not feel like rebellion. It felt like rhythm, a quiet rhythm of nations rediscovering their own heartbeat. What began as economics had become something far deeper, a change in consciousness across Ghana. Something invisible yet undeniable was taking shape. It was not revolution in the streets, it was revolution in the mind. In the classrooms of Legon, professors no longer began lectures with Adam Smith or Milton Friedman. They began with Sankara, Nkrumah, and now Ibrahim Traoré. On the chalkboard, someone had written in bold letters, "Sovereignty begins with thought." At first, it was dismissed as youthful enthusiasm, but soon it began to spread. Political science students held symposiums titled "Africa, from Dependence to Design." Economics graduates debated how to create Pan-African supply chains instead of waiting for Western stars. History classes replaced European case studies with African ones. Ghana learning from Burkina Faso, Nigeria learning from Mali, and outside the walls of academia, the same spirit flowed through the streets. At cafes in Accra, conversations that once revolved around visa lotteries and scholarships now revolved around soil, trade, and self-worth. One journalist wrote, "For the first time, ambition feels local." It was not just a political pivot, it was a psychological liberation. In the minds of the young, dependency no longer felt natural, it felt insulting. Aid was no longer seen as generosity, it was seen as a leash. And the question that echoed across the continent was no longer who will help us, it was who will stand with us. Even in villages far from the capital, the change was felt. Community radio hosts spoke of African solutions to African hunger. Farmers began pooling resources across borders, trading seeds and irrigation techniques without waiting for international NGOs. For the first time, cooperation was not charity, it was choice. In this new climate, Traoré's name became shorthand for dignity, and Mahama's for balance. Together, they represented a kind of duality that Africa had long sought: courage without chaos, pride without isolation. A political cartoon in a local paper showed two men shaking hands across a map. The caption read, "The new axis, not of rebellion, but of remembrance. And that was exactly it. This was not defiance for defiance's sake. It was remembrance of a time when freedom meant more than flags and loans. When a journalist asked a student protest leader what the Wagadougou-Accra Corridor truly meant, she smiled and said, "It is not a road for trains. It is a road for ideas." That road, she explained, would one day carry food, power, knowledge, and something rarer than all of them, respect. Because for all its ambition, Ghana's pivot was never about rejecting the West. It was about rejecting permission. Permission to choose one's own partners, to define one's own destiny, to say yes without needing to say no. And as the sun set over the new rail tracks north of Tamale, a worker etched a line in the wet concrete with his finger. It read simply, "Africa builds for itself." When history knocks again, the question will remain. Will we answer as dependents or as brothers? Before we close, let us pause. What you have just heard is not simply an episode of history. It is a reminder that sovereignty, dignity, and hope are still alive, waiting to be claimed. If this message has moved you, then subscribe to this channel. Not because we ask for numbers, but because we are building a space where voices of independence are honored and where stories of pride continue to be told. By subscribing, you are not just supporting us. You are choosing to walk with us into the next chapter of Africa's unfolding story. It did not begin with rebellion. It began with an embrace. 2 presidents, 2 nations, 1 sentence that cracked open the silence of a continent. We are one people. Colonial borders divided us. History will record the tariffs, the policies, the shifting alliances. But what people will remember is the feeling, that moment when Ghana and Burkina Faso stood side by side and the idea of Africa began to breathe again. Because this was never about rejecting the West, it was about refusing to be defined by it. It was about standing tall in a world that had long expected bowed heads. The Wagadougou-Accra Corridor may one day carry trains, goods, and tourists, but beneath its tracks runs something invisible, a current of trust, of dignity, of rediscovery. Each rail a symbol, each handshake a reminder. Freedom is not inherited, it is rebuilt again and again by those who remember who they are. Some in Washington called it drift. Some in Brussels called it danger. But in Accra, it felt like clarity. Because for the first time in a long time, Ghana was not walking toward anyone. It was walking with someone. And together, they were walking toward themselves. So when history looks back, it might not recall the press releases or the policies. It might remember something far simpler. 2 men beneath the West African sun, daring to say, "We are one people. Colonial borders divided us." And maybe, just maybe, that was the moment a new Africa began to rise. The embrace between Mahama and Ibrahim Traoré was not an end. It was an invitation for every African nation to remember that borders drawn by strangers need not define brothers forever. An invitation to build roads not just of steel, but of solidarity. An invitation to reclaim what was always ours: dignity, sovereignty, hope. If you believe borders should no longer define brothers, leave one word below: unity. If you believe dignity is the truest freedom, write rise. Because history is not watching, it is waiting. And the next chapter of Africa's story is not written in the capitals of the West. It is written in the hearts of those who dare to say, "We are one people." The corridor is open, the road is long, but for the first time in generations, the direction is clear: forward, together, free.